I still remember the exact moment I realized my marriage had shifted into something I no longer recognized. It wasn't during a fight. It wasn't during a confession or a dramatic discovery. It was during a laugh, one that wasn't mine. The office rooftop was glowing with soft yellow lights, the kind meant to make corporate gatherings feel warm and human. Glasses clinked. Music hummed in the background. People smiled the way they do when they want to be seen smiling. My wife stood a few feet away from me, radiant in a navy blue dress she had asked my opinion on that morning. I had told her she looked beautiful, and she had smiled absently, already distracted by the importance of the evening. Her boss was the reason we were there. Ethan Cole wasn't just her manager. He was a name that carried weight in the company. The kind of man who spoke and expected silence in return. Tall, sharp-eyed, effortlessly confident. The kind of man who never raised his voice because he never had to. People leaned toward him when he talked, like gravity worked differently around him. I was introduced not as her husband, but as an accessory. "This is my husband," she said, lightly, as if she were pointing out a detail in the room. No name, no story, no pride, just a label. Ethan looked at me with a polite smile that never reached his eyes. He asked what I did, and when I told him I worked in logistics for a small regional firm, his eyebrows lifted just a fraction. Enough to sting. "Oh," he said. "That must be stable." The men around him chuckled. Not loudly. Just enough. I smiled because that's what you do when you don't want to make your wife uncomfortable. I smiled because I didn't want to be the reason the air turned awkward. I smiled because I had spent years learning how to swallow moments like this and call it maturity. But then he kept going. "So you handle shipments?" he asked, swirling his drink. "Boxes, routes, deadlines. I imagine it's repetitive. Must leave you plenty of time to think." Another chuckle. This one louder. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, my wife laughed. Not nervously, not apologetically. She laughed like it was genuinely funny. Ethan glanced at her, pleased, encouraged. "Hey," he said, turning back to me, "someone has to keep things moving behind the scenes, right? Without people like you, we'd never know how good we have it." The implication was clear. I was background, infrastructure. Necessary, maybe, but invisible. My wife looked at me then, still smiling, and said softly, "Just smile. He's joking." That sentence landed heavier than any insult Ethan could have thrown. Because it wasn't just about the joke. It was about what she chose to protect. I smiled. I smiled through the rest of the night. I smiled while people talked past me. I smiled while my wife leaned closer to Ethan during conversations, nodding eagerly at his words, mirroring his energy in a way she hadn't mirrored mine in months. I smiled while he placed a hand briefly on her shoulder, a touch that lingered just long enough to be noticed and dismissed at the same time. When we got home, she kicked off her heels and sighed happily. "That went really well," she said. Ethan was in such a good mood tonight. I asked her if she realized what had happened. She frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "He made fun of me," I said. "In front of everyone." She waved it off. "He jokes like that with everyone. You're too sensitive." Sensitive. I went to bed that night with the word echoing in my head. Sensitive. As if respect were an emotional luxury. As if dignity were optional. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing things I had ignored before. How often she mentioned Ethan's name. How his opinions seemed to matter more than mine. How she dressed differently for work now, checked her phone more often, laughed at messages she didn't share. I didn't accuse. I didn't interrogate. I watched. And once you start watching, the truth stops hiding. She stayed late more often. Work dinners became common. Team bonding, she called it. When I asked if spouses were invited, she said it wasn't that kind of environment. Funny how I had been invited before Ethan became her boss. One evening, she came home glowing, energized in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in a long time. She talked about a project she and Ethan were leading together. She talked about his vision, his ambition, how inspiring he was. I asked her if she still found me inspiring. She paused, just for a second too long. "Of course," she said. "In your own way." That pause told me everything. The next company event came a month later. This time, I didn't want to go. My chest tightened just thinking about it. But she insisted. "It looks bad if you don't come," she said. "People will talk." So I went. Again. This time, Ethan didn't bother with subtlety. He talked about success. About ambition. About men who settle and men who strive. About partners who grow together and partners who hold each other back. Every word felt carefully chosen. Every glance toward my wife felt intentional. And she sat there, nodding. When he made a joke about supportive spouses who understand their place, the laughter was louder than before. I didn't smile this time. I looked at my wife. She avoided my eyes. Later, in the car, she snapped at me. "You embarrass me," she said. "Why couldn't you just smile? Why do you always make things difficult?" That was the moment something inside me finally broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but cleanly. I realized I had been shrinking myself for her comfort. Lowering my voice. Softening my presence. Accepting disrespect so she wouldn't have to feel uncomfortable choosing me over approval. I stopped arguing. I stopped explaining. I started rebuilding myself quietly. I focused on my work, but not the way I had before. I took courses. I expanded my skills. I networked. I stopped thinking of my job as stable and started treating it as a foundation. I worked nights, early mornings, weekends. She barely noticed. Her world was getting bigger somewhere else. Then one evening, I didn't come home at my usual time. She called, irritated. "Where are you?" "At an event," I said. "What event?" I told her the name of a logistics conference I had never mentioned before. One I had paid for myself. One where I had just finished speaking on a panel about supply chain optimization. There was silence on the line. "You never told me about this," she said. "You never asked," I replied. Things shifted after that. I traveled more. I was invited to rooms I had never imagined entering. People listened when I spoke. They respected me. They didn't ask me to smile while being mocked. And slowly, my wife began to notice. She asked questions. She showed interest. She bragged about me to her colleagues, the same way she once bragged about Ethan. But something had changed in me. I no longer needed her validation. The final confrontation came unexpectedly. I attended another company event with her, this time by choice. Ethan was there, of course, confident as ever. But when he tried to steer the conversation toward his usual territory, something different happened. Someone asked me what I did. Before my wife could answer, I did. I spoke clearly, confidently. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't downplay. I simply told the truth. The room listened. Ethan smiled, but it was tight now. Controlled. "Well," he said, "looks like you've been busy." I smiled. Not the kind he had once demanded, but the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are. "Yes," I said. "I have." My wife looked at me differently that night. With surprise. With uncertainty. With something close to fear. "At home," she asked, "why didn't you ever tell me you were doing all this?" I looked at her and said gently, "You were too busy watching me get mocked to see me grow." She cried. She apologized. She said she hadn't realized how much she had hurt me. She blamed pressure, work, influence. I believed her pain, but I didn't excuse her choices. Because love isn't just about loyalty in private. It's about protection in public. We're still together, but not because I stayed silent. We're together because I finally stopped smiling when I was being disrespected and started choosing myself, whether she was watching or not. And if there's one thing I learned from that night on the rooftop, it's this. Anyone can laugh with power, but it takes real character to stand beside someone when they have none.